This is FLOSS Weekly. I'm Doc Searls, and this week we have what I'm calling a wartime roundtable. Katherine Druckman and Jonathan Bennett and I talk about news that's come up at a time when the world is in crisis, and what does this mean? And that's mostly happening in the second half of the show, so stay tuned for that. In the first half, we talk about the universal chiplet that's come out, AMD working on a new Linux GPU driver, and stuff that's come out that enables a lot of new development where there wasn't any possible before, down at the lowest, close to the metal levels. So there's that, and then there's what we do to deal with the war thing without getting political about it. It's really interesting, and that is coming up next.
Podcasts you love.
From people you trust.
This is TWiT.
This is FLOSS Weekly, episode 672, recorded Wednesday, March 16th, 2022. Wartime Roundtable. This episode of FLOSS Weekly is brought to you by IT Pro TV. Give your team an engaging IT development platform to level up their skills. Volume discounts start at 5 seats. Go to itpro.tv/twit. Make sure to mention TWiT30 to your designated IT Pro TV account executive to get 30% off or more on a business plan. And by Collide, that's Collide with a K. Get endpoint management that puts the user first. Visit collide.com/twit to learn more and activate a free 14-day trial today. No credit card required. Hello again. Good morning, good evening, good whenever it is, wherever you are now in parts of the world on daylight saving time, which may become permanent in some places. Anyway, I was actually an hour off this morning. I was here an hour early. So anyway, I can't operate a clock or a calendar competently. Anyway, so this morning we are guestless, and so once again we have each other. Today it is Katherine Druckman and Jonathan Bennett here to talk about stuff, and there is a lot, in fact, to talk about in the open source world. Here we are, all three of us. For those of you advantaged by video, we are all here. How are you guys doing this morning or afternoon, depending on where you are? You guys are both Central Time Zone. Yeah.
It's Central Time here as well. It's a good day. Boy, I would not mourn the passing of the twice a year daylight savings time dance, but we'll see what happens with that.
Yeah. Well, there's apparently in the U.S. bipartisan support for making it permanent. Like, make sure that the sun is not overhead at noon. We don't want that anymore. We want the sun like at 11 o'clock now. That's the idea. Which I don't know if that's a good one or not, but that's on the table.
Well, I will say that having two little kids has made daylight savings time even more of a pain because adults we can go back and forth. Losing an hour, gaining an hour, that's no big deal. A 1-year-old and a 3-year-old just don't get the memo, so they're up. The
circadian clocks. There they are.
Yeah.
Our youngest is now 25, but when he was young, he basically kept our hours. I've never known a baby who just said, no, I'm up all day. I'm going to be up till 11 or whenever you guys are going to bed. I'm going to go to bed then, and then like at less than a year old, he could climb out of the crib. I'm not kidding. Climb and like a mountain climber and then come into our bed in the middle of the night. Like, wait a minute, what's that?
Yes, I understand. We have some of those same experiences.
We're living that. The other thing is that it's dark earlier, right? So you're taking the kids out to the school bus when it's still dark out. Is that the case where you are? I don't know. That used to be a complaint.
Our kids wake us up in the morning at when the sun rises. Usually, when it gets bright enough in their room that they can't sleep anymore, they'll come pat into our room. Okay, it's time to get up, guys. Okay, fine. Wow. So neither of them are quite old enough for school yet. Yeah,
that is a team. Wow. So basically just due to, human factors, we don't have a guest today. So We promised the same guest later. We had somebody scheduled, so that will happen. So we actually have a number of things to talk about. So Jonathan, you put some in our co-chat. You want to go down, pick one of those and get us rolling?
Sure. So I've got a couple of things.
We got our ad.
Oh, I'm reminded, by the way, by the voice in my head, which is not mine, which is fortunate. Like I said earlier, I cannot operate a clock, including the obvious one. That we are, this episode of Floss Weekly, I'll take that from the top so I'm not laughing during it. That would be good. This episode of Floss Weekly is brought to you by IT Pro TV. Your IT team needs the skills and knowledge to ensure your business is a success. And with IT Pro TV, more than 80% of users who start a video actually finish it. IT Pro TV is engaging, and your team will enjoy learning on their platform. Give your team the tools they need to make your business thrive. Courses are entertaining and binge-worthy, keeping your team interested and vested in learning. The tech industry is evolving, changing rapidly, and your team needs to be trained today. When a new software release, system upgrade, or cyber threat faces your business, IT Pro TV offers the training and perspectives of those disruptions within days, if not hours. Why is IT Pro TV right for your business? Well, get all training and certifications for your team done all in one place. IT Pro TV has every vendor and skill you need for your IT team training. They provide Microsoft IT training, Cisco training, Linux training, Apple training, security, cloud, and so much more. Over 5,800 hours worth, ranging from technical skills to compliance to soft skills. You can do so much more with an IT Pro TV business plan. Track your team's results, manage your seats, assign, unassign team members, and access monthly usage reports. See metrics like logins, viewing time, tracks completed, and more. Easily manage teams, manage subsets of users or teams by providing them with customized assignments, monitoring progress, and reporting on usage of the platform. Assignments can be full courses and or individual episodes within courses. Advanced reporting, get immediate insight into your team's viewing patterns and progress over any period of time with visual reports. Don't forget that IT Pro TV has individual plans too. Give your team the IT development platform they need to level up their skills while enjoying the journey. For teams of 2 to 1,000, volume discounts start at 5 seats. Go to itpro.tv/twit. Make sure to mention TWiT30 to your designated IT Pro TV account executive and get 30% off or more on a business plan. Okay, after one false start, we'll have a real one with Jonathan, who I think has some news in the queue.
I do. I've got something interesting that we kind of discovered this during the Untitled Linux show because one of my co-conspirators over there actually has a background in doing chip fab work. And so kind of we worked this out during the show, and it seems like it's something pretty interesting. And I think there's a pretty big open source hook here as well. So we got to cover a little bit of history of the Intel AMD wars. You know, AMD with their new Zen processors, they decided to use, they call it a chiplet design. And it's like 8 cores on a little tiny chip that then gets embedded in their bigger processor. And then they came out with the EPYC, which is their server processor, and they put 2 of these together and they connected them with a technology they called Infinity Fabric. I'm going somewhere with this. So Intel comes out and says, you know, in their marketing, they said, oh yeah, AMD did this. They glued chips together, but if you want a better solution, use Intel. So that was the shade that they were throwing. Well, interestingly, there is now a Universal Chiplet Interconnect Express. It is a new open standard, and signing on to it is AMD, ARM, Google, Intel, TSMC, and more. Some really, really big players are signing on to this. And it is essentially, it's a way to take these little individual, like sub CPUs, little slices of processors, put multiples of them together on a single chip, and then you use this fabric to connect them together. And so during the Linux show, I was saying, it sounds really cool to me, but I don't know if this is going to be one of those things that is just a flash in the pan and we never hear about it, or if it's going to kind of take over. And the guy that I was talking with, who absolutely knows this stuff, goes, no, this is a big deal. This is going to be revolutionary. Okay. And then we started talking about a second story, and that is something that AMD is doing. And it's the way their Linux GPU drivers work. So in the past, they have taken their, when they do a code dump, because AMD has an open source driver in the Linux kernel that they support for their graphics cards. And in the past, they would wait kind of as late as they could to not give away their secret sauce, to not give away, all the different features that's going to be in a card release. So they would wait, and then finally they would have a code dump where the supporting code for a new GPU came in. And they have changed it to where they are now doing individual, they call it IP blocks, intellectual property blocks. And so instead of a massive card dump, they just do a release for, here's the video decoder. And they'll do a release for, here's the block that does the ray tracing. Well, if you put these two things together, there's something really interesting that you suddenly see that might be happening, and that is chiplet GPU design. And again, we kind of kick this around, and it really seems like it might be a thing. And that is, if AMD has their ray tracing, and one of the interesting things that they could possibly do with this is build their ray tracing with, say, 3 nanometer, and then build their power supply stuff with a 14 nanometer process. So you've got these different chiplets, and then you connect it together with this new technology. And then they've got their open source drivers to make it all work together. It might be what AMD and potentially Intel too, kind of one of their solutions to the chip shortage that we're all seeing. If you can mix and match and have smaller chiplets rather than a big monolithic die, it's a potentially really interesting thing. And then the other thing that we were thinking about and how this really ties into Linux and open source is, why stop there? Why couldn't you do something absolutely crazy like take an AMD CPU chiplet and an ARM CPU chiplet and put them on the same board and connect them with this? And then the thought is, well, there's no way Windows is going to run on that abomination, but Linux probably would. So it's something real interesting to look out for, because, again, this is an open standard, so whoever wants to use it can. There could be some real fun stuff coming out of this. That
I've always thought that open source is not especially compatible with having a single source of chips at the most basic level. That it has to run on Intel 386 or equivalent. And Apple is sort of the opposite of this, is it not? Where it's just basically saying, we got the M1 now, it's ours. Hell with you. We're doing our own thing here. This could leapfrog them, could it not?
Yeah, it definitely, it could empower Apple to do the things that they want to do. It could be, I see it as a win for everybody, except anyone that wants to lock people into a single technology, because it has the potential to kind of shake things up.
Yeah, it's a little like, my involvement with the chip business is now 30 years old. But it reminds me a little bit of when field programmable gateways came along, and there was, at least in corners of different markets, there were lots of opportunities that opened up. It seems similar to that, only it's more at a deep fundamental level.
Yeah. So there's been a thing that's happened with computers over the last 50 years. We started out with the mainframes, and pretty much all computers were mainframes, IBM, the big metal. And then, you had the mini computers come along, like the PDP-7, the PDP-11, and that's where Unix came from. That shook up a lot of things. And then as more time went by, you had the microcomputer come along, and that's, your Intel 8088 and the x86 platform and all of that kind of fall under the microcomputer banner. And then for the last few years, we've kind of been living in the SoC world, the system on a chip, which is sort of shrinking that down yet again. And that's most of your ARM processors, and a lot of the new desktop and server processors are essentially SoCs now. And it's kind of interesting. I'm thinking, are we looking ahead and we're seeing that the next thing after SoC is going to be the chiplet? I don't know.
Well, integration has always been huge. I remember when I was, again early on in the 80s, the IBM PC compatible business was mostly an integration business. It was entirely an integration business. You just basically took a bunch of parts and you pushed them together. And then there was the add-on business. You had the Ethernet cards and the token ring cards and the memory cards and the rest of it. And then more and more of that got compressed down to a chip. And I even remember talking to the Intel people back then saying, all these other businesses are going away because we're going to put it all in one place. But still that impulse is huge. And it seems to me as I hear you talking about this, and I'm sort of reading at the same time, there's an opportunity for a lot of new creative businesses in here, I would say.
Yeah, creative businesses, creative products even. So Intel and AMD kind of shook things up when they started putting a GPU on the processor. Intel's been doing this for a long time. And so, suddenly you don't have to have a dedicated GPU. It makes it a whole lot easier to get into a new computer. And it's fascinating to think, well, what's the next thing that they're going to start putting onto chips now that there's the flexibility to do it? And, you mentioned field programmable gate arrays, FPGAs. It's interesting. Both Intel and AMD have in the past couple of years, AMD just closed the deal, have purchased the two biggest FPGA players in the market. And so, I think FPGAs on your CPU is something that's, well, it's here in some markets, in some server markets. But it's something that, maybe it's the next big thing.
That is cool. I didn't know about that one. That's Xilinx that they bought? I'm looking at the background there.
Yeah. AMD bought Xilinx and Intel bought, I can't remember who, but the other, there's two or three big FPGA players, right. and Intel picked one up. I can't remember what the company name was, but several years ago they picked that up. And I remember sitting at a conference and an Intel guy was telling us about how they were, even then, this has been a few years ago, even then they were starting to sell, big server chips to businesses and the thing businesses were telling them was, it doesn't matter how much they cost, we need this technology. And it was just as fast as they could turn them out, people were picking them up. Because, once you have an FPGA, for things like machine learning and algorithms and all of that, it radically improves what your machine can do.
I'm of the belief that what we're trying to do with open source, what business wants to do anyway, I think at not even at a meta level, I think down at the most basic level, what you want is maximized optionality. You want maximized optionality for users and customers. You want it for developers. You want it at the hardware level. You want it at the software level. And of course, the urge to lock people in and control markets and the rest of that are one of the many ways a company can compete, but it doesn't have to be the only way. So, I mean, it's just sort of interesting to me that even lately, in areas not remotely related to what we're talking about right now, there's been a lot of conversation about optionality. Actually, it's in games. How much optionality do you want to give players within games? And I'm not a gamer, but I'm involved in conversations about it because one of the projects we have going on has to do with games, and they're all people a third my age. So, but that optionality as a term is pretty important, I think, as a virtue.
Yeah. To finish that thought, it's actually Altera was the company I was thinking of. Intel bought Altera back in 2015. And that's one of the things that kicked off this whole having the option, as you say, of putting FPGAs on processors. That's really kind of one of the cores of open source. In fact, if you go back to sort of the Free Software Foundation's founding principles, one of those principles was giving users the freedom to do what they want to with their own hardware, which is really the same idea, giving people options.
I think it'll be interesting to see,
Good.
come back and revisit the whole topic once you start to see the effects. I feel like it would have far-reaching effects, and once we see them, it's going to be very interesting. I feel like it's great, it's interesting news to cover, but I feel like we're almost like premature because it'll be so much more exciting once you actually see the fruit of their labor.
Yeah, we're definitely looking off into the horizon on this one. This is some upcoming stuff. I don't even think as an individual user, you can buy a CPU with an FPGA in it yet. That's all pretty much goes to your big companies on big server purchases. You probably need to spend $10,000, $15,000, $20,000 to even get into one of those.
Yeah. It's always fun.
That's the way it was. Yeah.
Once it becomes attainable. Reasonable.
Yeah, so you just need now somebody to put an ad in a computer magazine that you can build your own. Send us $500 and we'll send you the kit. You can build your own.
What is a computer magazine? Sorry, that's a whole other conversation.
It's a blast from the past.
That's interesting. I mean, it's once you have proof in puddings that people suddenly want to do something with it, right? Yeah. As soon as somebody made the first, maybe it was not Steve Jobs, but Steve Wozniak with the first Apple I, is saying, I can take a bunch of spare parts that I took from Hewlett Packard where I was working, and I made myself my own little mainframe here. But he wasn't alone. Sinclair and others were doing similar things around that time. Commodore, Osborne, and others. But there were magazines. What was the chip? The 6500 something. There was one that was began with a 6. That was in.
There's the 6502. Was a bunch of Commodore products, and I think actually ran the Nintendo and the Super Nintendo. The 6502 was in a lot of things, and then you had Intel's 8088, and I forget what the other one was. But yeah, there were a couple of them that were just real ubiquitous at that time.
Because I remember actually like going into a store in North Carolina and seeing a magazine called 6502. There was already a market there of people wanting to hack on that, and with that thing. Again, it's that, but I think it's once you see something made with it that people start getting ideas of what else they can start doing. And there's always this tug of war. There you go, Team 6502. For those of you who are not visually impaired at the moment. Yeah, the chip that launched the revolution. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's and maybe this collection of new things can be that. You were just saying, Jonathan, that at this point nobody's going to get a chip with an FPGA on it. Ordinary wizards aren't going to get it, but at a certain point, maybe something like that happens, or maybe the smart thing to do is that, or put it on a board, or make it, something you can fool around with. I like that idea.
Yeah, I think we're kind of waiting for the current chip crisis to go away before some of these new toys really become readily available. Goodness, I just a couple of days ago lucked out and found a new AMD GPU for a close-ish to MSRP and snapped it up. And I was telling people about it. And the next day, people were checking the link I sent them and said, no, this is now $300 over MSRP. Goodness, it's moving fast. The amount of stock is so limited, and the companies are pushing these products out as fast as they can, but for various reasons, things are it's moving slow and very difficult for us regular folks to get a hold of some of this new tech.
That's a good point about, the rare metals that go into the chip shortage we're having right now. There's, catalytic converters, palladium, aluminum, nickel, copper, other things like that. An interesting thing about that, and I'm only just still learning about this now, is that, and we're seeing it with gas and oil, is that because it's such a worldwide market, it doesn't, even if one country has all the oil it can use, the prices still go up there because there's a shortage somewhere else. It's because it's a global market. And but with it's going to be interesting to see what happens with rare metals that go into the fabs that make everything we do possible, and how quickly we get whatever we're looking for.
Yeah, so there are this has been happening for a while in the United States, kind of quietly, but there are a lot of countries right now that are thinking about this question of how much should we be exposing ourselves to this global market? Because if things go wrong and the global market blows up, then our economy blows up too. And so I say the U.S. has been thinking about this. There have been a couple of bills and funding come along in the past few years for building chip fabs in the United States. And a couple of those are in the bring up process. Like they're being constructed. We don't have anything that's ready to push chips out yet. And, that is, of course, because the big chip fab is TSMC, which is the Taiwanese semiconductor manufacturing company. It is in Taiwan. And for several years now, the future of Taiwan has been rather precarious. I'm not interested in getting into all the geopolitics there, but it's something that people have been thinking about. And I guarantee you, especially with the things going on now in Ukraine and Russia, pretty much every country out there, there's got to be some portion of their government that's saying, how do we insulate ourselves from the rest of the world so that when things go wrong, it doesn't crush us too?
Speaking of chips, it is kind of like at a poker table. Back at the turn of the 90s, I worked with Hitachi Semiconductor. And at that time, it wasn't long after Intel basically outspent everybody else in the world on CPU fab, basically, on their x86 chips and Pentiums back then. And I remember Hitachi itself saying, we can't keep up with that. We're going to make memory. We're just going to do memory. And then along came Korea, especially with Samsung, saying, we can outspend Japan. And they had a government that was behind them on it, and basically Hitachi and Matsushita and others in Japan didn't so much fold on that, but just sort of backed off, but kind of doubled down. I remember Toshiba did on big flat screens because they had better success in making like 1K TV screens than others did. Kind of like Sony did with the Trinitrons with vacuum tubes 24 years earlier. But I wonder, if a government wants to put, saying, okay, you don't have enough chips to put on the table cash-wise to make a big fab, we'll put them on the table for you because we want us to have independence around that. I haven't heard any talk about that, but it seems like it's an option that a government would have.
It's happening in the United States right now. I don't remember the amount, but several billions of dollars, I believe, were set aside to pay people like Intel and I'm trying to remember the different companies. It was more than just Intel, maybe Intel and TSMC as well. The United States government said, we will write you a check for this amount if you will build a fab in the United States. It's absolutely something that is happening right now.
Yeah.
It reminds me, you've had Kyle Rankin on the show, haven't you? I think you have.
I think so. I think we have.
Which reminds me, of they make Purism, the company he works for, makes a phone that's entirely built in the US. It is, of course, extremely expensive as a result, but it seems like worth noting in this context. There are people out there making that effort. Yeah.
Well, there is a push in places like the Department of Defense even. I've had some conversations with people there that are, very concerned with various chips being made in overseas fabs and the things that they have done to try to have essentially a paper trail where they can go back and confirm that, this particular FPGA was built to specifications. Nothing has been slipped in. We know it's working exactly the way it's supposed to be working. And to try to verify that when it was built in an overseas fab is such a headache. And so, that idea of everything being built in the United States for security reasons, for valid security reasons, is something that a certain group of people care very much about.
Right. Yeah, if it's important to you, you'll it's worth the extra cost of doing it that way. For sure.
Yeah.
How much is it? What happens if we click? Oh, it's $2,000. Yeah, there we go.
Whew.
Is that for the phone, for the Purism phone?
The USA.
The Librem 5.
But
it's a great phone.
Can you put a price on security? I don't know.
I'm afraid we could put a price on almost anything. Go ahead.
Depending upon who you are and what you're working with, that may be worth it. Let's see. I'm trying to think of a name of someone that would fall into that category. If you're the next Edward Snowden, but you're leaking information about China instead of about the U.S., then something like the Librem 5 might make sense. It might be worth the investment.
So since we're getting into global supply chains and the rest of it, and we're sort of backed up on a bunch of topics around that, I want to pause right now and let everybody know that this episode of Floss Weekly is also brought to you by Kolide. That's Kolide with a K, Kolide. It's a new take on endpoint management that asks the question, how can we get end users more involved? This is in contrast to old school device management tools like MDM, which lock down your employees' devices without considering their needs or even attempting to educate them about the security of their laptop. Kolide is built by like-minded security practitioners who, in the past, saw just how much MDM was disrupting their end users, often frustrating them so bad that they would throw up their hands and just switch to using their personal laptops without telling anyone. In that scenario, everyone loses. Kolide, on the other hand, is different. Instead of locking down a device, Kolide takes a user-focused approach that communicates security recommendations directly to your employees on Slack. After Kolide is set up, device security turns from a black and white state into a dynamic conversation. This conversation starts with end users installing the endpoint agent on their own through a guided process that happens right inside their first Slack message. From there, Kolide regularly sends employees recommendations when their device is in an insecure state. This can range from simple problems like the screen lock not being set correctly to hard to solve and nuanced issues like asking people to secure two-factor backup codes sitting in their downloads folder properly. And because it's talking directly to employees, Kolide is educating them about the company's policies and how to best keep their devices secure using real tangible examples, not theoretical scenarios. Kolide cross-platform endpoint management for Linux, Mac, and Windows devices that puts end users first for teams. That's Slack. Get endpoint management that puts the user first. Visit kolide.com/twit to learn more and activate a free 14-day trial today. No credit card required. Visit kolide.com/twit today. Okay, so supply chain. We live in the internet. We're on that now. All of us listening, watching are on the internet right now. This is a global thing. It is not a national thing, though nations can get in trouble with each other and shut parts of it down. And in some cases, that's strategic. In some cases, that's wanted. So, who wants to take this one first? Katherine, you actually in our back channel, we're sharing a couple of items that are in that direction. Want to fill us in?
Well, sure. I think there is a lot of pushback, obviously, against Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and there is a lot also of open source contribution in that area of the world. So, there are petitions, for example, there's an issue on Gitlab, or there was, I think it appears to be closed now, basically asking to cut off, Russia and therefore Russian users, which, we can talk about, but that was the ask. Similar ask was made of the Drupal community to cut off, to mark Russian users as read-only, basically limit access. And it's somewhat cheekily, a lot of Ukrainian Drupalers pointed out that Pornhub was blocking Russia, so we should at least be able to do as well as they did. But yeah. So anyway, there's a lot. The interesting part is that there is such a vibrant open source community in Ukraine in particular. I mean, yes, there are obviously developers all over the world. You'll have developers in Belarus, developers in Russia as well. And as you mentioned earlier, we know somebody who works with people on both sides, and it's a very difficult situation to be in right now. But in particular, when that large a part of the globe is in conflict, I have to expect that, some trickle down effects to open source contribution, to commerce among, companies doing business in the open source space. And, I think that's going to continue to affect a lot of us, and it'll be scary to see how. But yeah, and in particular, I wanted to highlight the pushback against specific companies. GitHub, for example, also was sort of pressured into blocking access from Russia. I don't believe they have. The standard response from most companies working in the open source arena is, strong support for Ukraine, obviously, linking to charities where people can contribute. But falling short of fully blocking Russia from the internet for probably obvious reasons, which I think we could probably talk about and we have opinions about, because again, the nature of open source is contribution. And while I don't think anyone is encouraging the Russian government itself to contribute to our open source projects, we still value the individuals.
Yeah, I've seen several companies do things like this, and I'm going to go out on a limb here and say, I think history will judge poorly those that punish the Russian people for the actions of the Russian government. I like GitLab's response there, and they essentially said, "Look, this is not a thing that we're gonna be able to do." GitHub, for instance, GitHub has been one of the main ways that people in China are able to get information past the Great Firewall, because China cares enough about development that it allows GitHub. And so people go and post things in GitHub repos and GitHub gists that would otherwise be entirely unavailable to Chinese citizens because their government would censor it. I think you have a similar situation in Russia. There are things on GitHub and GitLab that probably the Russian government does not want their citizens to know about, information or techniques they don't want them to get to. And I really have a big ethical problem with the idea that we have to punish the individual Russian citizens for the actions that their government has taken. I think that is short-sighted and dangerous. But I apologize for getting political, but I feel pretty strongly about that.
I feel, I feel the same way. And I mean, in some cases where you have but there are alternatives. Okay, so Starbucks says we're not going to deal in Russia anymore. You can still get coffee, I'm sure, probably somehow, somewhere that's not Starbucks. But you're preventing the good that a lot of these citizens are doing. I mean, even just in our own areas. I mean, what are they developing that could be on the side of helping Ukraine or helping people overall? Your point, Jonathan, about getting past the Great Firewall in China is extraordinarily important. And I think that obviously there's always going to be collateral damage, even when you're not bombing people, obviously there's enormous collateral damage on that. But there's, what that amounts to in some ways is friendly fire, and it's not necessarily friendly, and it is fire. And I think it's essential to maintain the global quality of the internet itself. I don't think any government should throttle anything that happens on the internet at all, anywhere. I just think it should be open. And there should be as many paths in and out of a region as possible. And even if bad things are done on it, I forget who said it, but it's one of the most important things I've ever heard, which is the sure sign of a good technology is you can imagine bad uses for it. And,
Sure.
and there are going to be lots of bad uses for the internet and for digital technology and for people communicating with each other. But because people do tend to be helpful, and civilization relies on people much more being helpful to each other than harmful, that it's important to keep communication lines open. And our world, the FLOSS world, the free Libre, the L in FLOSS, open source world is inherently a borderless one and wants to be borderless. And I think we need to keep it borderless.
Yeah. I mean, I understand it. I'm incredibly sympathetic to all of the people in Ukraine who are, I understand being in that position. If I were there, I would probably want to punish every single person in Russia right now. I wouldn't be able to make that, distinction. However, being distanced from it, we can see, while I understand the sentiment that, the people of Russia, maybe, a good portion of them actually support the war and support the government and all of that. But I'm also seeing, and thinking of the people who are are leaving Russia, or, having to take extreme measures to literally escape right now because they are in danger. And those people, need the internet to be open as much as anybody else. So, to that end, while I sympathize with the desire to, make collective punishment, I also, I don't see the benefit.
And we have listeners and viewers there.
Yeah, absolutely.
And now we do. Katherine, on the podcast you and I do, we got a note from somebody from Belarus the other day.
We did. Yep.
Expressing support. And we weren't even being political in any way, I don't think.
No,
but,
not really.
And
I don't want that guy's, that guy's internet to get his access to information and data and the rest of the world to get cut off, because those are the people who we want to support the most. So yeah.
Do we want to move into that? So you set us up for an awesome segue to talk about Starlink. Do we want to go there now?
Yes.
Oh, yeah.
Right.
So you mentioned this idea of continued access to the global internet. Well, one of the things that's happening in Ukraine right now is, of course, ISPs are being taken offline. Well, a certain billionaire who has a more than passing resemblance to Iron Man, Mr. Elon Musk, our modern day, our real life Tony Stark, said, "Hey, let's do something about this. I happen to have this internet company that can put internet anywhere in the world." And so there's been already hundreds of Starlink terminals that's been shipped to Ukraine, and some interesting follow-on effects with that, and things that people have had to worry about that it's never been a thing before. Starlink is now, Elon tweeted about a week ago, I think, that things are going to be a little slower for SpaceX because they're putting more of their resources into hardening Starlink against hacking and cyber attacks and spectrum blocking. And of course, we're not sure exactly how tongue-in-cheek that was, because he kind of has a Twitter shade war going on with some Russian officials right now. But no, it's interesting. So the takeaway from that is people in Ukraine are being delivered Starlink terminals to get them back online to the global internet, regardless of what's going on with their local ISPs. And I think that is fascinating. It's something that we've never really been able to do before. I have seen, and this is kind of something of a rumor, but back several months ago when things went upside down in Afghanistan, there were apparently Starlink terminals delivered there as well to certain groups of people. And unfortunately, I haven't been able to nail that down with a really good source. If I can, I'm gonna write about it. But it's something that's real interesting to see that this is the world we live in now, where a billionaire can get on Twitter and say, "All right, we're sending you guys magic internet boxes. Hold on."
Yeah, it's kind of mind blowing.
It is.
It is. There's there's a tweet from, and it's public, a guy named Oleg Kutkov, who I believe is in Ukraine. He says they have 300 members of the Starlink community. It's private right now, but it's a real thing, and it's sure to grow. I mean, there may only be 300 terminals in the country. I don't know how many there are there.
I think that,
and I also know
that first shipment. I think that first shipment of Starlinks was actually 300 terminals. So
yeah. So those 300 are on the case, but it's so, and maybe it's because you have more experience with it, Jonathan. You might be able to speak to this. That they're not especially portable. You have to set one up, and you have to set one up where there's a good view of the sky. And you can't move them because then the system doesn't know where you are. Is that right? So you have to kind of re-register it somewhere else?
So here's the thing. That is the way that Starlink worked up until a couple of weeks ago. There are, so first off, there are some users that have gotten, there's a flag way down in the depths of Starlink settings called roaming. And for the longest time, roaming was set to false. Well, there have been a few users that have reported that roaming has gotten set to true. And that essentially means that they can take Starlink anywhere that there's service and plug it in, and it'll come up and work. And then again, an Elon tweet, SpaceX is now working very hard, and I think has turned on in some cases, actual on-the-road roaming, so that someone can literally now throw their Starlink dish in the back of their pickup truck, and it will track as you drive down the road. And it's pretty interesting because all this stuff is apparently coming out because of the Ukrainian situation and because of the dangers of having a Starlink dish on display in your house with what's going on there now.
Yeah, that I'm thinking too. I'm also looking at the back channel here to see if anybody's got something on it. Yeah, the internet treats that. I was going to bring this up. Somebody's going to bring up. I don't think it was John Perry Barlow who said the internet treats. It was John Gilmore, I think, or Whit Diffie, that the internet treats censorship as malfunction and routes around it as damage, I think. But it's a trope. It's a saying, and I think that does happen, even if it doesn't happen on the internet itself. What I'm thinking about right now, and I'm rapidly looking in the background to see if I can find evidence of it. But how's ham radio working there? I think we had Steve Stroh on recently. Ham radio is a thing. It doesn't have national borders. Is it being used? I don't even know. Anybody have anything on that?
I haven't heard anything about it, but you've got to imagine that people are, Ukraine and Russia, there is a radio community there, of course. And I'm absolutely certain that it's being used. The thing with ham radio, so in our chat room, Virgil asks this about the Starlink. Couldn't that be used to target location? And potentially. That's the thing with ham radio. It's very easy to triangulate where someone is coming from with the ham broadcast. And so that kind of puts a damper on hams getting out and chewing the rag, as they say. And one of the things that, again, that SpaceX has been talking about is if we send you one of these Starlinks, be careful, because if someone really wanted to, they could use that radio signal, ride that radio signal down with a missile and hit you with it. And so there's been recommendations like, we send you 100 meters of cable, put it as far away from your house as you can, and things of that nature. And we laugh at it. That's a very macabre sort of dark humor. But it is potentially a thing. And so I wonder if that's maybe why we're not hearing so much about ham radio, is because it's in the interest of those using it to be quiet about it.
Well, and I just found this, and I put it in our own chat from March 4th, that Ukraine maintains ham radio silence in a state of emergency. In fact, a decree went down on February 24th, right when the war started, from President Zelensky, and that included a ban on the operation of amateur radio transmitters for personal or collective use, and collective use. And the Amateur Radio League there reported this week that it received many messages of encouragement from the worldwide ham community. So I suppose that's off the table. I'm so used to thinking of ham radio as something you use in an emergency, but I guess during a war is different than a hurricane.
A war is a different kind of
find
emergency. Yes.
Different kind of emergency. So that's an interesting fact. We were being asked to have a ham show in the back channel. Yeah, we had one.
And for another.
We can do it again. There are all kinds of open source projects around ham radio. I'm confident that we can do it again. Although one of the interesting things we talked about during that last show is Starlink replaces some of the use cases for ham radio. If you can just pull it out and drop it in a yard wherever you're at, and have emergency communication, it makes the use case for ham radio in that particular instance a little less important. So I don't know, will Starlink kill ham radio? Probably not entirely, but
I think ham radio is in a way it's about using open spectrum or bands of open spectrum that are available to anybody. Obviously, we still license people to use it, but the idea is that amateurs, that's why it's called amateur radio, that amateurs can get on and communicate with anybody over a band that isn't licensed out commercially. And obviously that, Starlink is using a commercial band of some sort or part of one where but anyway, they've cleared the rights to use some spectrum to carry data. They didn't, I don't think they asked permission to put the satellites up though, did they? They just found some orbital paths that were relatively unconstrained and used that.
No, they went through, you've got to go through the FCC, you've got to go through the, in fact, it's been quite a bit of a beef between Elon Musk and the, what's the name of the agency? The flight agency,
FAA.
Yes, the FAA, because the Federal Aviation Administration, the FAA, also does the licensing for rocket launches and all of those things, and it's been actually quite a bit of a problem that an agency that is intended to regulate aircraft is now also being asked to regulate the new speed at which launches happen. So there's been quite a bit of paperwork and problems that have resulted from that. But no, there was quite the parting of the red tape that had to happen before Starlink could even go up and get into orbit.
I'm glad you know about that. Mostly what I'm familiar with is that the astronomers don't like it, because they get streaks across their time lapse photos of the sky and stuff like that. Of course, that's when the sun is on them and they're on the completely dark side of the world. It's a different matter, but
yeah,
it's an issue.
It is, but even that is more complicated than it seems, because that really only happens during the ascent phase. So for the first couple of days after the launch. And then, finally the satellites get high enough and spread out enough that you don't really get them in your photographs anymore. So and of course they also did there's now a black coating on the bottom of the Starlink sats. So hopefully it'll show up less in those photographs. So some of that these days is, people just continuing to be angry over the thing without really understanding the details of it, which is kind of a theme for the internet these days.
I used to love, especially when my youngest guy was a little boy, we go up and out and watch iridium flares. There were these, the first satellite telephony was done by Motorola or by a spinoff of Motorola called Iridium. And I knew Ed Stiano, whose idea it was, and was one of the toughest guys I've ever worked with. But anyway, he kind of shepherded this thing, which at the time was like $5 billion, which is back then it was real money. Anyway, but those things had big solar panels, which would catch the sunlight at certain angles and would be like -7 or 8 what is it, illumination? Where I think Venus is up to like -3, so it'd be like twice as bright as Venus, and it would be this slow, bright light across part of the sky, and it was like, whoa, what's that? Well, that was an Iridium satellite, and of course, all of those were deorbited a while ago. And Musk actually deorbited a bunch of his recently when there was a solar flare that hit them and pushed them out of where they needed to be or damaged them or something. And then they took 40 of them or something and pushed them down. And I guess those things burn up completely before they hit the ground, right? Is that the case?
Yes. In fact, that's something that probably the FAA again has been pushing for a lot recently. Is if you're going to put a satellite up, make sure that no part of it hits the ground. It is to be built in such a way that it entirely disintegrates on the way back down. The deal with solar flare was the solar storm. It apparently just enough changes the density of the upper atmosphere, and so these satellites on their launch, they're actually quite low. Their initial orbit is really, really low, and right on the edge of their little tiny ion thrusters having enough power to push them up into their final orbits. And the solar activity made the upper atmosphere just dense enough that their engines couldn't keep up. And so physics dictated that those satellites were coming back down.
Yeah, there was. I'm trying to look it up quickly. I don't think it might have been a Milsat. It was a military satellite of some sort from the U.S. that went up and it blew up. Something went wrong with it, and it went into a very long elliptical orbit that had millions of pieces of debris that come floating back through from time to time. And that was kind of like the example of what not to do. That's sort of stood out there for a long time since. And the big pieces of it are going to be in orbit forever. So they're now actual, satellites, but they're not like on a low orbit. These things are on the big, long elliptical orbits.
Yeah. All right. I do have one more story. Do we want to move over to that? Have we tapped out on? All right. Yeah, we're getting close to the end. And this is something that really fascinated me. Imagination Tech. It made the Power VR graphics processor, which that sounds familiar. That's because that's the GPU that powered the iPhone for the longest time. No longer the case. Of course, Apple is spinning their own silicon these days. But Power VR is still a thing in certain pieces of hardware. And this was one of those bits of hardware that was just a nightmare to try to do anything with on Linux. And in the past few days, engineers from Imagination Tech have published an open source driver for their GPUs. And in fact, so one of the things that happens sometimes when hardware companies publish an open source driver, sometimes you see that story and you say, oh, great. And then you dig into it and, oh, no, it's, the Linux 3.5 kernel from 5 years ago, and they've just done a code dump and they're never going to touch it again. No, these guys are actually doing it the right way. They are trying to get it upstreamed into Mesa, which is the GPU driver part of the Linux kernel. And they are they're actually trying to do this right, do the development and do the support for it in the upstream projects. And when I first saw this, I thought, oh goodness, that's a cold breeze coming up from the nether regions. I'm feeling hell hath frozen over, because this is one of the last companies that we expected to see pushing an open source driver. But it's interesting, Intel and AMD have both done this now, where they have a good portion of their Linux drivers are just, it's not out of tree. It's not closed source. It's just developed along with everything else, just by official Intel or AMD employees. And so it's really exciting to see yet another company jumping on the bandwagon of not just doing it open source, but doing it in I don't know how you would say it, a community first way, perhaps, but just really going out of their way to do this the right way. I think it's pretty cool to see.
Well, we are actually down toward the end here, and we already know the answers to our 4 questions. There was no blockchain news this week, as far as I know. There's probably more use of it than ever, but but we do have our various plugs that we can do. But first, I mean, I don't know what the right way to do this is. Do we just go into, reflecting on what we just talked about? I guess we could do that first and then get to our plugs. I'm looking at both our back channel and this front channel at the same time.
I don't know. It's kind of I don't like to reflect on war too much, but I don't think we have a choice, I guess, since it's happening. The open source driver is really cool news. I'm glad you brought that up, because that is, I don't know. I like the intro to the article that you linked, who had this on their bingo card. It's unexpected, right? To see something like that, which is, I don't know. It's kind of like, it's particularly mind blowing, having been around this sort of thing for so long. And if you had said that this type of maker would release an open source driver, which, for me, like 20 years, sorry, I wasn't around 20 years ago. I'm not that old, but let's say 10 to 15 years ago, I would have been shocked.
Yes. Yeah. Well, it has to be kind of a result of the things that, say, Google is doing with the Chromebook, with Android too, for that matter. But also like what Valve is doing with the Steam Deck. You have these companies that are now building lots of really, really good hardware, and they're doing it with up-to-date Linux kernels and as much open source software as they can. I mean, the Steam Deck is pretty much just running Arch Linux with SteamOS installed. It's more or less what it is. It's now at the point to where you can build Chrome OS for whatever platform you want to, and all the bits for that are open sourced, and it's using a relatively up-to-date kernel. So there's actually a lot of pressure on various companies. If you want us to use your hardware, then you've got to support our development process. And exactly. More and more that development process is open source.
Yeah. And you don't have to sell it as hard anymore. It's the use case is so obvious that, it makes it worthwhile and somewhat obvious to go ahead and support, because otherwise you're alienating a huge group of users.
Yeah.
And I imagine, you said it was the driver for that Apple had used for a long time. And the history of open source is full of lots of enterprising people finding fantastic new ways to work with old stuff. And I imagine this qualifies as old stuff to some degree. But I'm really interested to see how this thing goes down. And by the way, I'd like, because we've gone into a lot of interesting topics today, I'd love to have listeners and viewers get back to us on what they think, and what give us feedback, give us other topics to talk about. Send us guests as well. There's always a shortage of guests. So we're very interested in having interesting people on here and not just ourselves. And I think it occurs to me that there's so many shows that we do that are good for years. We talked about stuff that's war related here. I still think a number of the topics we touched on here that are relevant to the current situation in the world are not going to go away. There's always going to be conflicts. The internet is always going to want to be an international thing, a global thing. So I think that, but there are sides to be taken. There are issues to be discussed here. So love to hear from you. So guys, got plugs?
Katherine, you go first.
Oh, wow. No pressure. What do I have to plug? I don't know. You can always listen to me and Doc pontificate some more. Oh, hey, that's the company that employs me, and they're great. We'll check them out. Great. And also
those of you watching, it's
Ukraine, incidentally. Yeah. And then there's that other podcast where you can hear me and Doc, Reality 2.0. And if you like our banter, you can hear more of it there. We'll have to have Jonathan on too, make it a whole thing.
That's an interesting thought. We should do that.
Yeah, it'd be fun. All right. I do have a couple things to plug. I too have that other podcast, but in my case, it's the Untitled Linux Show. And that you can catch live on the Discord. And then we also now have a dedicated RSS feed, but only for Club TWiT members. And we've recently gotten some numbers back on how many of you guys are listening to that. And it's a reasonable percentage of the Club TWiT members tune into the Untitled Linux show each week. And that's pretty exciting to me. So if you're not, well, then you should go subscribe and listen to it, because we get all kinds of fun, geeky, techie Linux news, and it is just great. And then the other thing I'll plug is over at hackaday.com. I do a security article. A column goes live there every Friday morning. We cover the news, the things you need to know about in the security world. You learn about security. You might even learn how to make a few bucks by doing security research if you want to. One of my columns back a few weeks ago was the story of how I made $4,800 by essentially running Ping and Telnet and a couple of other really, really simple tools, and found something really interesting and got paid for it. So all kinds of fun stuff there too. Make sure to check it out.
Okay, and so Katherine already did my plug, which actually is as the host that unplug anyway. Want to let you know our guest next week is Melody Mekfessel, which I think is just one of the great names. I don't know if we'll talk about that next week or not. And she's of Observable, CEO and co-founder of that, and out of San Francisco. So looking forward to her and talking about that next week. So until then, I'm Doc Searls. This is Floss Weekly. We'll see you next time.
Don't miss All About Android every week. We talk about the latest news, hardware, apps, and now all the developer-y goodness happening in the Android ecosystem. I'm Jason Howell, also joined by Ron Richards, Florence Ion, and our newest co-host on the panel, Wen Tu Dao, who brings her developer chops. Really great stuff. We also invite people from all over the Android ecosystem to talk about this mobile platform we love so much. Join us every Tuesday, All About Android on twit.tv.